and then we can get going. So a final welcome to everyone for joining us for this workshop looking at the relation between Samvera and digital strategy. The aim of this workshop, just to clarify, is to focus very much on how Samvera can help support digital strategy at your own organizations. The key purpose of it is to go a little bit beyond what the earlier workshop, looking at which covered an overview and introduction to Samvera, looked to cover. That earlier workshop was very much about sort of rolling out everything that Samvera offers, and just providing people with a brief insight into all the different parts of what Samvera is, and there are many different parts. This workshop is intended to be we'll cover some of the similar ground. It's difficult not to overlap it. So I know that if some of you attended the earlier workshop, then my apologies, there will be some overlap of content, but the aim is to at least present a summary of what was discussed earlier as a precursor to leading into more of a sort of discussion and exploration of what the relationship is between what Samvera is, what it offers, and the digital strategy planning and engagement that you have at your own organizations. There are elements why we are clearly looking to present to you or make a case for why we think Samvera ought to be a part of a digital strategy at your organizations. At the same time, we're equally interested in understanding what your drivers are, what your constraints are, what your needs are, because we are a community-based organization. We are aware of what goes on within organizations. At the same time, quite often different organizations have different drivers, and therefore it's important that we try and find ways of capturing what those drivers are so we can understand how Samvera can help to meet them. So I will share my screen and start the presentation. Okay, so moving on then quickly, I would also like briefly to thank my co-presenters, Karen Kariani, Nabila Jaffa and Alicia Morris, and you'll hear from each of those as we go through this presentation today. I am Chris Orr. I'm the interim university librarian at the University of Hull in the UK, and the chair of the Samvera Marketing Working Group, which was the group that put together this workshop for Connect this year. So just an overview of what we're going to cover. I'd like to sort of do a little bit of starting with you, as much as anything, because that's how most of these workshops would start if we were face-to-face, having an element whereby we get input from the attendees on what you'd like to make sure you see covered in the workshop. A little look at the role and value of repositories and our digital collections for our libraries. An overview of the Samvera history and background to place what Samvera can provide in context. And then a look at the Samvera vision and the elements within that and why they've been included within that vision of what Samvera can offer. That will be then enough of me talking. That will hand over to you again then to talk more about strategic drivers and Samvera. And I'd like to say thank you for the input that we've received in response to the questions I circulated earlier this week to help inform that. Following that, we'll then look at a bit more closely at the particular elements of what we believe makes Samvera of value to organizations and why we think it's of value that for your organization to engage with Samvera as a community and as a provider of the services that you need. We'll have a few takeaways and next steps in terms of how you can continue with your engagement with Samvera beyond this workshop. But we also want to make sure that in addition to the discussion session, we have time at the end for Q&A based on any of the items and points that have been brought up as we go along. So to start with you, I just again say thank you for the input that you provided in response to the preparatory questions that I circulated earlier this week. Just as a reminder to those if you weren't able to take a look at them, we asked people to name up to 3 key strategic drivers in relation to digital repositories and the management of digital content collections. To ask whether or not your institution preferred to use off-the-shelf solutions or create solutions to fit your local needs in this area, and what the drivers are for that choice. And how do available system options match digital strategy needs, just generally, and what are the gaps? Because it's clearly understanding what those gaps are is the place where ideally we would want Samvera to either be currently, and maybe highlight the fact that Samvera is in that gap, filling that gap, or indeed to be aware of it so that we can look to see how Samvera can fill that gap. So very briefly, in response to some of the feedback that we got earlier this week, this is a small word cloud capturing some of the terms that were used in those responses. And as ever with word clouds, of course, there are keywords that leap out. So in this case, I suppose infrastructure and usability would be the 2 main ones that stand out, but also open. So key elements there, which I think have certainly informed everything that we've done with Samvera, but also in relation to what it means to deliver a digital repository infrastructure. And there's a whole range of other words around there in terms of the drivers and terms. I wanted to ask just very briefly, we'll come back to this in the discussion session, but just to ask very briefly whether or not in quickly reviewing that, there's anything that particularly leaps out as not being on there that you feel it would be useful for us to take account of or come back to as part of this workshop later. Please either shout out or stick it in the chat. Okay, I realize I can't see the chat now, so I don't know whether anyone's put anything in it.
I haven't.
No, fair enough. Okay, well, fair enough. In that case, we'll take it as it is for now, and then we'll come back to anything.
A late coming thing. One thing I realized drives us is a desire to support reuse of our data in the repository.
Fair enough. Yes, that's not there. Yes, yes. Because ultimately, if we're not keeping it for so it can be reused? Well, when you say reused, do you mean reuse for as in getting access to it so you can use it as it is, or reuse as in use it for other purposes?
This is Anna Gould at the WPI, Worcester Polytechnic Institute. And I realized this really in talking with a colleague about our, a major driver for our repository is making it possible for our faculty and students to add value, reuse the data that's in the repository in a bunch of ways. Sort of an endless bunch of ways. So it's kind of a discovery that we made along the way, that it's not going to be just our providing more and more and more and more services, but that there's going to be a demand to do things with the data. Yeah. It's almost a collections as data kind of issue, and it may be a long time before we can get there. Although I think Alicia's already doing some stuff along those lines.
Okay, no, thank you. That's really useful to hear about. Okay, well, we'll move on and we'll come back to this later to inform the discussion as well, but thank you. It's very useful to have those initial insights. So moving on from there, I wanted to first consider that the role and value of repositories and digital content collections, largely to sort of take Samvera out of the equation. Why do we sort of do work? Why do we actually why have we found repositories to be a valuable part of the offer that we make? And the management of our digital collections. Essentially, I wanted to highlight our libraries hold physical and digital content collections, and a sort of a combination of the two there with access to physical collections on a digital device. But we clearly increasingly focus our attentions on managing digital collections, whilst at the same time having to manage all the physical collections that we continue to hold and make available for our students and faculty. We carefully build structures to house our physical collections, from the very traditional libraries of the type that in the first picture there, through to the rather grandiose architectural examples of some of the libraries that have been established and built over the in recent years at different institutions, whether academic or public. That's an example of an academic library at the moment, recently built. So we put a lot of effort into those. We put a lot of care into them. We put a lot of consideration as to what it means to actually both store the materials in these buildings and also facilitate their reuse through access to those physical items within that space by providing learning spaces, ways in which spaces where things can be reused and repurposed, maybe things where they can be used in the context of learning and research. There's a whole host of considerations and care given into that space. I think one of the dilemmas that we face with our digital collections is that quite often the equivalent that way of holding up many of our digital collections is to store them securely. I sometimes find that some of the ways in which we're storing digital materials and presenting them, and I'm not talking about repositories here, just generally storing them and presenting them or providing access to them, is almost the equivalent of building a big warehouse, throwing all the books in at a door and then hoping that you'll find one when you come back to it later. So I think the value of repositories and the role that they have is, to a sense, for me, also always about taking the care that we put into our physical buildings for our physical collections and finding ways in which we can use repositories to apply the same level of care for the ways in which we can hold, manage, deliver the digital collections that we have, and then also facilitate the reuse of those collections further down the line. Essentially, how do we actually bear the burden of what it means to hold all of our digital collections and actually then make them give them purpose? It was thinking about that care and attention that led to the origins of Samvera. In 2008, there was a collection of a conversation that started at Open Repositories 2008 in Southampton in the UK, which led to ongoing conversations and then a collaborative project that was set up between the University of Hull, the University of Virginia, Stanford University, Fedora Commons, which is now Duraspace, of course, and then working with a software consultancy called MediaShelf, which is now migrated into data curation experts, so still very active in the community itself. We got together not because we had funding for a project or because we were looking for funding for a project, but primarily because we recognized that we had a common need, and that was the need for multi-purpose, multifunction, multi-institutional repository-enabled solutions to address the range of different digital content management needs that each of our institutions had. And therefore, it was worth our while getting together to try and work out how exactly we could do that best. That led to the creation of the Hydra project that many people will have come across, which of course is now Samvera. Key to the development of Samvera at that time then was about recognizing that it was getting together as a community, a small community at first, admittedly, but nevertheless a community, which enabled us to focus on what our needs were and how we might seek to address those needs, independent of how we might then actually put them into practice technically. So the community and the thinking and the planning and the design came first, then the technology came down further. And that was based on an early recognition that the only way we were going to make this, whatever we were building, to work for all of our needs was through working together. and it led us to using the catchphrase, which is at the bottom of our slide template now, of course, if you want to go far, go together. But it really was an original way of thinking that took us forward at that time. Not least because, and hands up here, as a University of Hull, we recognized we were a very different institution to both University of Virginia and Stanford University. And the needs that we had were quite different and on a different scale to those other two universities. At the same time, there was a recognition that that did not mean that we could not have a common way of tackling those needs, because essentially those needs were the same. It's just that the way they were exercised, the local needs, the scale of the need was different, but that was something that could be built on top of a common platform. So a Samvera timeline, just to highlight the activity over the last 12 years, where we started in 2008. And as I said, the first software commit was actually only in 2010, following 2 years of thinking and planning. That led to some first production rollouts at each of the original institutional partners in 2011. And then a formal creation of the partnership. We realized that we were working as partners, and we wanted to forge a way in which we could expand the number of people who were involved whilst maintaining the level of commitment that we felt was going to be important to make sure that whatever we were building would continue to be able to be sustainable. So the partnership was formed in 2012. In 2013, there was the first release of Avalon and Sophia, Avalon being an AV solution for based on the components that were available at the time, and which continues to evolve and develop today. And Sophia was a recognition that whilst we first put together some components that people could use to build their own solution, Sophia was the first package, the way of bringing them all together, which allowed us to say, here is a product, I suppose, or that you could take and make your own without having to start from scratch. The growth of the community led us to organizing the first Connect in 2014, which has blossomed ever since, coming up to this one this year. So virtual it may be, but it still goes from strength to strength with nearly 300 people signed up this time. And then in 2017, Hydra became Samvera. And then Hyrax and Haiku, the multi-tenant version of Hyrax, were both released. And I think what that evidenced is that then since then, a lot of the activity that's taken place has been about taking what we've done and maturing it and evolving it and continuing to grow it and develop it, but not necessarily feeling the need to make any radical changes, because we feel that what we've got is actually a really good, stable base for what we can build and continue to develop from. I mentioned ITAV there, we'll come back to that. It Takes a Village, which was a lyricist project to identify aspects of what it means to mature a community, an open source community. And we did our own analysis against that, analysis scheme that lyricists produced, and we'll come back to that to showcase the results of that. But it was comforting, I think, that in reflecting on our own maturing, that we were making very good progress as a community. So the community structure are essentially that we have a series of partners. The idea is that we invite institutions to be partners, we encourage them to get actively involved, and key to this is that active involvement. So those institutional partners derive from the three initial institutions which committed various different levels of activity to help take forward the creation of Samvera and then its ongoing growth. And various other institutional partners have made substantive, and I really do mean quite substantive, contributions over the years as we've gone along. And that remains the pattern of operation now, where partners commit to providing various different levels of resource across various different roles and activities in order to help contribute towards the different aspects of what it means to continue maturing and developing what Samvera can offer. We do ask people to make a commitment in their application for partnership as to how they can commit time and effort and resource. And it's left to them, the individual institution, to decide how they would like to do that. And the reason we decided to go down this path is that whilst with many open source communities, we were observing that you could push out a product and then see what interest there was and to gather the community around you of users. We felt that we'd seen too many open source communities where that reach out, that engagement, then faded away as because people didn't feel they were able to commit or didn't want to commit. And we wanted to start off by saying, if you want to get involved, actually commitment is really important. And we say that on two levels. One is that it's really important to sustaining what you as an organization have chosen to commit to, but equally it's about recognizing that in order to get the best out of what Samvera can offer you, engaging with the community, participating in the community, and sharing what you have done with the community is as good a way of getting value out of that investment as it is just simply just taking it and using what Samvera can offer you. In order to help guide the direction that Samvera takes, there is also a steering group which is made up of 9 elected members taken from the partners, and this group acts as stewards of the project. It is based on individual membership rather than institutional representational membership, and members serve overlapping 3-year terms, so there's always a sort of rolling continuity of membership over the period of time. That election method or approach was introduced 3 years ago, and as a result of the community taking a serious look at its own governance and deciding that in order to mature and evolve on an ongoing basis, that introducing this level of democracy and this encouragement of participation through election would be a very valuable and important way to move forward. We also have a roadmaps alignment group, and this recognizes that I'm using the old term, Samvera has a number of individual components which can be used, and each of those has a roadmap, has its own pathway for how it chooses to evolve. And we have a group that then looks at each of those components and how they're looking to evolve to ensure that they continue to align, because all of those components combined help to make the product, Hyract, Haiku, Avalon, what they are. And so that group offers a very important coordination role. We also have a group of working and interest groups, and this is how members of the community can participate right across the range of different roles that are within organizations and which are involved in working with repositories. Interest groups are those where people get together in order to discuss an idea of common interest without necessarily looking to carry out any specific piece of work, but simply to share information, share ideas, and to work out what may be involved in taking forward further development within Samvera to achieve what would be identified as commonly held aims. If there is a specific piece of work that comes out of that discussion, or if there is a piece of work that comes out of other discussion in the community, then a working group would be set up, which has a particular charter in order to achieve a particular end. So I suppose another way of thinking about it might be a task and finish group. So it has a specific piece of activity and it's looking to achieve. And then quite often working groups, and maybe sometimes interest groups, they all have lifespans. They don't necessarily carry on just for the sake of carrying on. They carry on because there is a recognized need and a value in maintaining them over time. But that need may come to an end. And then ultimately, we are a community, but it's a community that looks to use of technology, and very much that then involves the developer community, which of course is made up of those who are formal committers, who make formal commitments to the ongoing development of the products and the code and the different components that make up Samvera. But equally, the developer community involves all of those who are adopting Samvera or one of the solutions it offers, who will carry out their own work and who can still continue to feed that back regardless of whether or not they may be a partner or not. And we would encourage them to do so. So all in all, the idea is that there are routes through which engagement with this community can take place at many different levels, and that participation at those different levels can help to facilitate engagement in getting involved in Samvera. I mentioned the Samvera partners. Here is the list at the moment, which you can find at the bottom of the Samvera website. 32 at the moment, and covering a whole range of different organizations, from universities to media organizations in terms of GBH Boston, but also vendors. We wanted to include or make sure that where vendors play a very important part in the provision of services around open source software, and we felt it was important that they then have the ability to contribute to the community in the same way as the institutions alongside, and can bring a very valuable voice to the discussions about the ongoing development of Samvera. Adoption is far and wide globally, I mean predominantly in North America and in Europe, but extensive and very pleasingly and increasingly in different countries around the world, as some of those blobs indicate. And just to highlight in terms of the use cases of Samvera, the idea is that repositories may be used for many different purposes, the whole range of them you can see at the top there. The idea is that instead of having to implement a different repository solution for each of those, is there a way in which you can create a single digital repository infrastructure stack, which provides a whole host of scalable, robust, shared management and preservation services across these different content types? In the same way, referencing the analogy made earlier, that when we build our physical libraries, we don't do it just for one item type. We don't have a library for journals and a library for books. We have one library that is capable of serving up different content types. Can the same not be done with repositories? So that was the theory that took us forward in terms of designing Samvera and its solutions. When put into practice, what we see is that the wide range of different organizations that are making use of Samvera, which is indicated on the left there, are using the solutions for a whole range of different purposes. And some on the right there. And some of those are very much, I suppose, single use cases, because that was the particular local driver, the local need, which Samvera was used to help address and fulfill. At the same time, some of those are where Samvera has been implemented, but actually the use cases cover more than one of those different applications. But it's all being based on the same underlying infrastructure that Samvera can provide. So just to summarize, why did we do this? We recognized there was a common need across different institutions, but also that whilst we might have gone off and done our own thing, it was invaluable for us to consider that there were common threads and common basis upon which we could actually develop our individual solutions. We wanted to build a platform that allows for those localized requirements, whether that be standalone or increasingly, as we've gone on, of course, in the cloud. It wasn't such a big thing when we started, but it is now, of course. We recognized that we weren't going to be able to actually go off and develop our own solutions because we as individual institutions did not have the wherewithal to be able to do that. Therefore, it was important to us to work together to sustain those solutions. And part of working together on those solutions was essentially to help us learn about and take advantage of technical innovations, recognizing that technology has enabled us to do hugely different things in the last 10, 20 years. But there's constant learning about how to do this, how to do that, tricks of the trade, different ways of doing things. And being part of a community that is active in making use of those different tricks of the trade and sharing that information has been very valuable to the way that Samvera has been able to take on board over the years. Key has also been the ability to take advantage of general software design principles and practices without necessarily feeling we have to create a library solution, benefit from the wider and deeper learning about how to take advantage of technologies which we can apply to library and repository space. So to look at the Samvera vision, which was developed a couple of years ago to encapsulate many of the points that I've made so far. The Samvera vision there says, so it says, is a vibrant and welcoming community of information and technology professionals who share challenges, build expertise, and create sustainable, best-in-class solutions, making the world's digital collections accessible now and into the future. So to unpick some of the key terms there, and we've underlined those key terms within their vision deliberately as encapsulating the core elements of what makes Samvera what it is today. So Samvera is a vibrant and welcoming community. I think that the design of the logo for this year's Connect really encapsulates the vibrancy of what Samvera can offer. And as that picture there shows, which is from one of the previous Connects, we are a very welcoming community. And that may be in face-to-face meetings, which we will sincerely hope we can get back to in due course, of course, but equally through the online channels that we have available. We look to try and share what we have through case studies, through demonstrations in online calls. We look to provide information to help people make their own decisions. So we have a very thorough FAQ. And clearly with all FAQs, of course, if you find a question that isn't addressed in the FAQ, let us know, because then we can provide an answer. And we create or look to create sustainable solutions so that people can take the basic components of what Samvera offers and build your own from scratch, but equally we can provide a number of solutions to act as a starting point dependent on the particular use cases that you have and how those solutions might apply to those use cases. So I'll hand over to Nabila now to pass the discussion over to you based on what you've heard so far, to respond to that, but also to address a couple of questions that Nabila will now describe.
Thanks, Chris. So thank you all and for answering some of the questions that Chris sent you. This is the slide that is actually Chris already talked about. This is from the question 1, which was like, if you can name 3 key strategic drivers in relation to digital repositories and the management of digital collections. And we kind of already talked about this, so let's go to the next slide. This was the second question, which was if you prefer off-the-shelf or custom created solutions, and what are the drivers for your choice? So this slide shows different answers from people. And we just want to maybe take a minute here. It might be hard for you all to read this, but all these are transferred into a Google document. So we'll go to that Google Doc, and this is where we can discuss more on these. But maybe we can take a minute and see if any of you has something to share out. Anyone who added these comments, if they want to share out something, or anyone else. Let's see if anybody has any comments. And it's hard to read faces or have any interaction with these Zoom meetings, which is like, I guess. So on the left side here, it's these 4 sticky notes are more about off-the-shelf. People prefer off-the-shelf. because it's much easier. It's like if there are not enough technical expertise, so it's much easier to get something and just use it. On the right-hand side, it's more about people who are like open source and also have technical expertise, or some of these are a combination of both as well. So let's go on to the next slide, and then when we go to the Google Doc, I think that's somewhere we can have more discussion. We do have one comment here from David, that having the staff to maintain and run the systems. Yeah, definitely. That's another thing. And Ellen is saying focusing resources on things that are unique needs is critical. So reusing existing solutions, whether open or vendor provided, is a strategic priority. Yep, that makes sense. Okay, this was the third question, that how do available system options match your digital strategy needs, and what are the gaps? So the orange sticky notes, it's a shade of orange, that shows the gaps indicated. The green ones is what they match. And the pink one is there was more like a question that was there. So I will maybe first talk about the question here and see if anyone else has some comments about it too. For my personal experience using at Michigan, we built our data repository with Hyrax, and we disabled some of the features in Hyrax when we were just launching the beta version. So that could be a way to go, is to use a solution bundle and disable some of the features. The other way could be that I think Chris mentioned, that Princeton has done, like using some of the components available on GitHub and building your own structure with that. So I see, Simeon, your comment there. It would be great to unpack this comment. Does anybody has anything else to say?
Because I've just to expand, I think you were unpacking the comment, and I hadn't realized that when I wrote it, but that's great.
Okay.
I think it's an interesting question. Someone thinking of Samvera is which route to go. Most people have gone adopt one of the bigger things and disable things, but Princeton has blazed a new trail by using components.
Yeah, it is an interesting question, and thanks for bringing it up. I think it also depends on how much dev resources you have, because if you are building something, then you need a lot more dev resources, while if you are disabling things, then it's a little bit less dev intense. Okay. There's a comment from Rosalind. Do you want me to read it, or Rosie, do you want to?
No, I can just, I think, we talked about allocating staff, and it's just, there's a lot wrapped up in that, right? Both from sometimes lack of technology skill sets outside of a library technology area, even some of the basic ones around like project management and that sort of thing. I mean, that can also bog down what ends up being your larger digital strategy. So that seems like a big workforce issue more than anything, but.
Yeah, that's right. That's true.
I was curious on this page about the comment about Fedora 4 and 5 having major digital preservation weaknesses, as to whether that was coming from the perspective of someone who was using Fedora as in its own right as a repository, as opposed to it being simply the repository that sits behind Hyrax. So it depends on whether or not the person who put that note is on the call.
I mean, I will speak for Fedora because I currently can. And I'm the chair of Fedora Steering, and we know that it has big digital preservation weaknesses, which is why we are building Fedora 6 to bring back many of those digital preservation sensibilities that existed in 3, and to make it much easier to use. So that is true. That sticky note right there is very true. And the work that they have done over the last year or so, hopefully will address that.
Okay, that sounds good. Looking at the time also, let's go to the Google Doc. And also we have one more comment from Mike. Hi, Mike, good to have you here. Do you want to say more about your comment or just?
Sure, yeah. Hey, everyone. So this is more from a technical point of view, but I thought it would be worthwhile to reflect on Stanford's current trajectory. You know, when you look at the partner list, our name is prominent up at the top as one of the founding institutions, and yet we have for a long time been stuck on Fedora 3 and used some componentry from within the Samvera community. But as we're evolving the Stanford Digital Repository, it's possible that we're moving away in a bit, at least from the tools, if not from the community. I don't think we're moving away from the community, but it's a continuing struggle to kind of fit the more monolithic or application level work that goes on in the community into our tiny service architecture. It's one of the challenges that we have. We love to use the tools more, but it's just kind of hard to make it work.
Yeah,
not a new story. I'm sure many of you have heard us say this before, but yeah.
Yep. Yeah, thanks for sharing, Mike. Okay.
I think what that does is it encapsulates a real challenge when it comes to deciding on our repository infrastructure and we want to put in place, which is that what Samvera seeks to do is to foster conversation and engagement to help you clarify what your needs might be, and then potentially provide you with the wherewithal to go about doing that. So very much the same pattern that got us Samvera going in the first place. Let's talk about the needs, let's work out what those needs are and how we might address those. And then let's try and make some technical solutions in order to help address those as well. And those technical solutions have evolved and continue to try and meet the needs that come up along. We have to recognize that in creating those technical solutions, sometimes we're going to hit needs that people have, and which people can then use those components. And in other cases, it may be that the pathway that people wish to take is a different one. But if the community has helped them come to that point of understanding what route to take, then all to the good.
Yeah, that's a nice segue to the document. And I have posted the link to the document. Chris, if you want to open up the document on your screen. Yeah, thanks. Okay. Can you all access the document too? Yeah, okay, I see a few people there, so that means people can. So in this document, we thought we can capture some thoughts and suggestions here, and also look at this question, which sort of we already started talking about, like what are your strategic drivers and how does Samvera foster it, or it helps it? Are there any mismatch? Like the last comment from Mike, I think that kind of ties in with the same thinking. So what we were hoping as part of this workshop is if we can take a few minutes and write down here in the document, you can say what is your strategic drivers, and is that aligned with Samvera, or if not, then how do you see it, how it's not aligned? And looking at the time, we wanted to get done by 2 o'clock with this engagement part. So maybe we just want to, take like few minutes and let's start writing in the document, and then we'll start the discussion at the same time while other people are still writing in the document.
I think one of the questions I'd like to throw out is picking up on that point that was made earlier about reuse, is to understand that whilst we might be putting in place a repository to manage digital content in the same way that we might build a library to house our physical collections, one of the ways that physical buildings have sought to try and support reuse is by creating spaces, creating tool sets, creating labs where reuse can take place. To what extent that is something that it would be useful to build into a repository in order to enhance those tools, or to what extent those are tooling that would more logically sit outside, maybe within an LMS, a learner management system, or yeah, which one would be the preferred option, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any thoughts on that? Yeah, thanks for adding some content there. So we are hoping to have more interactive session rather than just me reading it out loud. Would anyone be willing to share their thoughts they put in the document?
I'd be happy to kick it off, Nabila.
Thank
I
you so much.
wrote the line that says meeting accessibility requirements, and I filled in some elements of alignment, but I'd be interested to hear other viewpoints. So from my perspective, accessibility requirements are everyone's problem. We should all be meeting WCAG 2 and such things. Different universities are under the gun in different ways to do that, but it's obviously efficient if we're all solving the same problem and all have the same needs. So that should be something that works well. And there has been an accessibility analysis in Samvera and work on some components. I will admit that I do not know quite where we stand on all components.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a good question. I can just add to it that I know there have been some usability studies on HireX, and also each individual institution does their own. We at Michigan, we also had our own testing done. And one thing we found was on mobile devices, the Google Analytics chart is not responsive. So I just want to highlight the process there, that I put in a ticket, and it was really nice. Quickly Tom looked at that ticket, worked on that ticket, and made it made some changes, and it was fixed. So it's nice that when institutions faces any of these issues, and when it goes back to the community and someone works on it, so it kind of helps everyone. Now, whoever gets the new updates from HireX, they will have that responsive Google chart there. So.
I can talk about the limiting the number of technologies being supported by my organization. I put that in. And what I like is that the work my team did to build, so we use Hyrax for backend curation of content, and then have a just a standalone Blacklight instance on the front end that displays the content. And what I like about that approach is, you know, the team, they did their work on Hyrax, and then they shifted over to the front end for Blacklight, and they learned a lot about Blacklight from that. And now they're moving on to replacing our Primo instance, which is ugly, with Blacklight. And so there's overlap in the technologies that they're using, right? So I'm getting more bang for my buck, so to speak. They learned something, they're using that again, applying it again to something different than a repository.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
I think, you know, for institutions like mine where we use Blacklight, that makes Samvera extremely appealing, you know, the overlap there.
Mm-hmm.
Can I pick up on another thread, which I think goes back to one of the slides that we had highlighting a concern about costs or desire to get off the shelf, or lack of local resource or skills base, is the degree to which the presence of vendors in the Samvera community potentially might assist with that, in the way that for other services that we offer as libraries, we would not naturally, in a sense, turn to the vendors that are available. One of the, for me, unique aspects of repository space is almost the lack of commercial vendors, and open source has filled that gap very successfully, and open source vendors have been a key part of enabling that. So does that offer a pathway through which institutions and people might be able to engage with Samvera in a way that they might not have felt able to do so otherwise?
Yeah, just to sort of speak to that, Chris, that's sort of why Emory has been able to do what it's been able to do. It's because of the vendors in the Samvera community work with us. They don't work off in their silo and then tell us what happens. So my software development team has partnered with those vendors and done co-sprints through all of our projects, which helps in a couple of ways, helps us see different processes that we can learn from, helps us change our own processes, brings new and fresh perspectives. And I would say that that's actually more of an open source ecosystem. It is in Samvera, but I'm having discussions with a Drupal vendor, Acquia, right now, and they are suggesting the same exact thing for moving us to Drupal. It's like, let's do co-sprints, let's do this together, right? So that is the benefit of working in open source, is that camaraderie with the vendors. It's not like the other vendors, if I may.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Do we want to talk about one more thing? It's almost time. So there is a comment about supporting directly or indirectly curation by users of resources in the repository, including allowing them to create connections between otherwise unconnected digital objects. So this is interesting like connecting with APIs and integrating with other components, products. This is interesting to us as well. Is there anyone else out there who feels the same?
I'm curious to know whether, I mean, that seems to sort of address or talk to that reuse case that was being discussed earlier. Right. That ability to take what they find in a repository and then reuse it in a way that you might not have envisaged.
I would also add, not just reuse of what you find in the repository, but existing services. So yes, the flexible lookup services, those kinds of things, taking advantage of existing infrastructures. And it kind of goes back to Mike's comment about microservices, but from the sense of not creating new microservices, but potentially taking advantage of APIs and ones that exist. We may get there, we may not, but that is the intention of integration with third-party services or other kind of tools.
Right.
I would certainly recognize that one of the downsides that repositories had when they were first created is that whilst they were intending to try and provide sort of more open access to content, they were effectively almost by accident created their own sort of mini silos, which simply sort of added to the whole issue of where content was and how you got hold of it in order to use it for other things. So the development of APIs and the ability to interact with content in different ways has been, I think, a huge development in that area.
I'd love to hear more if there's time about the item just below that. Also, the issue of complex objects. Not because we have that yet, but it sounds like it's going to appear any day now. What's the story? It says is not currently available. Is there interest or discussion of that?
I'll add that I'm the one who added the comment about wanting support for complex objects. We've been at Tufts been using an alternate access system for our complex born digital archives, but would love to be able to have it integrated in our digital library so that users could have one-stop shopping and search across all of our collections in one place, but recognize that implementing complex objects is really difficult because of structure and order and different metadata schemas necessary to accomplish this end goal.
Thanks.
I would say that I don't think that necessarily negates the idea that it would be valuable and I think of interest within the community to stimulate or have an interest group or a discussion in order to explore that further, in order to understand how Samvera might address it or how it might be tackled in connection with Samvera, because it is in surfacing the types of issues that have just been raised that helps us to understand further exactly what might be done on a collaborative basis.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And it also links to ArcLight as well, right? That is about archival objects.
I think ArcLight is more about archival description.
Okay.
And this would be more about access to those objects.
Okay.
I think though ArcLight has ways of embedding archival objects and display. Maybe Giarlo could say something if he knows enough into the display. So I think I definitely hear the complex objects issue. It is a problem in trying to figure that out. It would definitely be a good discussion and maybe a good working group if one has not already formed or discussed such things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, thank you all for the discussion. And looking at the time, I think we want to go back to the slides. And I'll hand it over to Karen.
Walk you through a couple of slides here that talk about how Samvera meets some of these needs that we've just been talking about. And those would be specifically the community, having a robust community, having a technology, and having people with skills. So, should we move to the next slide? So community engagement is the first one. A lot of open source initiatives are based around community, and it's one of the things that gives them what makes them strong as an open source solution. Samvera's starting point was the community and not necessarily the technology. People came together, as Chris mentioned early on, formed a community to talk about common problems as opposed to kind of circling around the technology to begin with. Communities do strive through commitment, and Samvera's commitment is strong. There are 32 current organizations that are partners. That includes some vendors and service providers. They're committed to supporting each other and in continuing the development of Samvera, whichever direction it goes. There's a contribution model that was enacted recently or put in place recently. The community contributes based on the size of the organization. And Samvera becomes then greater than the sum of its individual parts. So altogether, we are a much stronger community than we are by ourselves. There's regular communication online and where we can face-to-face. Unfortunately, this year Samvera Connect is not face-to-face, but it's still strong and there's still communication on an ongoing basis. The next slide. And it takes a village, as we all know. Lyrasis did a study to help communities identify their development and where they are in sort of the spectrum of development. And for Samvera in 2019, this is where we fell. For governance, we are in phase 2. We're growing. Governance there was a governance pact. I don't know what to call it. Somebody else come up with a name for me. Put in place a structure, governance structure put in place that we all agreed to. That was recently. The technology is in phase 3. It's stable, but it's not static. It's always moving forward and always shifting. The resources are in phase 2. We're growing. We've just put in, as I mentioned before, the contribution model from partners, and we're in phase 2 for community engagement. We're constantly growing, constantly outreach, constantly talking to each other. The next slide. And we are supporting skill sets, which is also critically important. There's engagement with technical outputs from Samvera that does not require specific technical skills, which enables local flexibility, which is great. There is training available, or at least there used to be, with workshops to get people up to speed on the stack and on the basics of the technology. Samvera helps develop skills for library staff. I have to say, me personally, have learned a lot from the community itself. Not as a developer, but purely as a library manager trying to build these technologies. And it's so helpful to hear some of the challenges that other people have had, to know that it's not just me. And that's often through shared engagement on common problems to find solutions. And sometimes the solutions aren't technical. Through learning about different areas of digital curation and seeing how technical solutions can apply to various challenges that we all have. There are opportunities such as Connect to showcase local skills, and it helps with your professional reputation to be informed about how other like institutions are moving forward with the same challenges. I think that's it for me. Is that correct? Is any?
Yep, I'll move on to the next one. One thing we wanted to highlight, I suppose, building off that skills side of things, is that one of the aspects of working in an open source community is that sometimes It feels like the main people and sometimes the only people who get involved in the community or the discussions are the techies. And clearly Samvera does develop open source technologies. And therefore we do have a very active engagement amongst those people who work on those technologies on the coding level or various other different aspects of managing them. But what's key, I think, is that we recognize that repositories are not just a technical solution. They are actually about the ways in which we curate our digital collections. And therefore we seek to paint a broader picture about not involving not just the technical staff, but also those staff who are working with the collections in different ways, maybe more on a curatorial basis. So for example, we have a number of interest groups that have addressed different aspects or are continuing to address different aspects of what it means to work with repository collections. Repository Managers Interest Group, which Nabila has helped to run for a while. We have a metadata interest group, and I think what the metadata interest group has done is been a really good example of an interest group where people come together who are not technical, but who are actually engaged in what it means to create data models and the relevant metadata around different objects, and would be an interesting place to locate maybe a discussion about complex objects as well. But which has then identified specific pieces of work which it felt it could take forward to help put into place or put into practice some of the ideas that they've been discussing, and has therefore spun off quite a number of different working groups over the years, which have then had their focused piece of activity, which has produced a specific outcome. And that outcome would not have been created and that learning would not have taken place if it hadn't had the input from the different contributors from the different institutions taking part. There's also a user experience interest group, and interestingly enough, that's evolving constantly. So at the moment at Connect this year, there is actually a proposal to make that a user interface interest group because of the changing needs and changing emphasis of what work needs to be done or what work can be done in order to enhance what it means to interact with Samvera repository. And then there have been archivist and digital preservation groups in the past, and these are good examples of interest in working groups which have, I suppose, had valuable and active discussions whilst they were meeting, but which then actually decided that they no longer needed to meet moving forward. In the case of both of these groups, I think there was a flurry of activity and interest in what it might mean to embed digital preservation functionality into workflows within Samvera solutions. There was work done on some of that, but ultimately I think there was then a recognition that it may be more useful to focus Samvera solutions on what they do well and to take advantage of what other separate digital preservation tools, for example, maybe Archivematica, can provide alongside what the repository provides. And on that basis, those groups have ended. That's nothing to say that those groups couldn't then be reformed. If there were specific areas of discussion, it would again be valuable to explore. On that basis, and again, I think this touches on the reuse, is that Samvera does touch on discovery and people who work on supporting discovery within institutions. It touches on support for teaching and learning and support for research. I would acknowledge that there's probably more that can be done in that area of reuse, and that would be a valuable discussion to take forward. But clearly what these repository collections are seeking to do is to make resources more easily available for inclusion and use within teaching and learning and research in the first instance. And then to take a specific example, there's been lots of work at Michigan related to the use of Samvera for publishing purposes and the use of Samvera behind the University of Michigan Press. So there are different ways in which different activities, different staff can get engaged with what Samvera offers, because it is ultimately about how we curate, reuse, and look after all of our different digital collections. Clearly what Samvera is doing is about highlighting the ways in which repositories and digital collections ultimately can be one of the library's USPs. And the more that we can find ways in which ways of supporting that, then the better. Conscious of the sense that much of this presentation, because of maybe our intended audience, but also about emphasizing the purpose and benefits that Samvera brings to those who engage with the community, we do of course have a technical platform, a set of tools and products and services. So just to describe them in more detail, key to those technical solutions that Samvera has produced has been the common endeavor and practice, and that's been built around a set of community principles, because one of the dilemmas of involving multiple people at multiple institutions is that they might have different ways of approaching something. So key to enabling Samvera to develop on an even keel has been to ensure that there is a common set of principles about how developers and technical people and staff come to working with Samvera, which has been hugely beneficial. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of that has been based on learning from general distributed software development practice, rather than, in a sense, trying to recreate the wheel within our library environment. Ultimately, when it comes to engaging with Samvera technically, it's about asking what level you want to engage at, and there are a range of options, some of which were then touched on in the comments and feedback that was provided. There is a platform and a tool set. You can take the components in GitHub to build your own solution. That ultimately does require the highest level of resource, because you really are looking after your own solution for that purpose, but it can be done. You can start off with an established solution, as mentioned earlier, the three that we have available: Hyrax, Haiku, or Avalon. Or you can work, if you don't want to work with them entirely by yourself, what you can do, as Rosie alluded to earlier in terms of some of the work at Emory, is work with a vendor on either a hosted solution, or to bring the vendor in to provide that skills input, that time input, that resource input to create what adaptation of those products you need for to meet your local needs. So I'll hand over to Alicia.
Okay, so we'll begin to wrap up, and so here are a few takeaways. Samvera is a well-established community, and through collaboration with our partners and adopters, we've developed a clear vision of how our community can continue to develop through discussion and the work of interest groups, working groups, the developer community, and the partner and steering groups. Samvera provides a place for our organizations to discuss and collaborate on work that meets the digital content strategy needs as they arise within our organization. By working together, the Samvera community provides a range of technical solutions and routes through which those solutions can be put into place. The community derives its strength and its resources from members and their many contributions. As you think about participation in Samvera, consider what you can bring to the table. It's true that you can adopt freely, but there is added value from participation and partnership. So for more information, there's the samvera.org website and a fairly detailed FAQ page. And on the Samvera wiki page, you'll find a lot of information on the current work that community members are engaged in. And on GitHub, you'll find developer code and documentation. And to get in touch, there's also community and technical related Google groups. So for that, we'll enjoy the rest of Connect 2020, and thank you for coming to the session. And we have a few minutes for some questions if there are questions anyone has.
Or to carry on the discussion from earlier.
All right.
Chris, so in the comments, in the chat, there's a comment about sharing the slides.
Yes,
Google Doc.
so it's certainly intended that these slides be available for sharing post this workshop. I'm just clarifying with the program committee exactly where that will be. I know that they're putting together a Google Drive site to hold all of the presentations, and I'm just getting details of those, and that details of that location will be circulated in due course to everyone who attends the conference.
And the chat, as well as any links that are provided in the chat, can be saved alongside the presentation.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that if there's any further input to the Google Doc that people would like to make, then please do continue to add to it, because that's, I think, already proving to be quite a valuable resource in informing some of the conversations that it would be useful to take forward following this workshop. What we didn't share also is that there are, below that Google document initially, if you scroll down in the Google document, there are the slides capturing the responses to the questions that we sent out, with forms there as well for people to add any further comments or thoughts related to those questions and the responses that were received. So again, if you have a moment, then please do take a look and add any further thoughts you may have.
Looking back at the Google document, we almost covered all the rows, I think, except one or two. So if anyone is interested in discussing those. Like the first one, sharing infrastructure across organizations, I think.
Is that actually two, that first row?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Simeon, you have some thoughts on that?
Go ahead.
The sharing of the infrastructure, that was ours. When we first got started at Tufts, and Tisch Library was investigating ways to build digital libraries. One of the foundational sort of strategic goals was to be able to share the infrastructure of the digital library, because we realized that it would just be too expensive to try to stand up separate digital libraries across the many libraries at Tufts. We're kind of a tub on each tub on its own bottom institution. And so back then it was Hyrax, but building on the Fedora Hyrax, Fedora Samvera infrastructure, became a great way to build the digital library and to form, close, pretty tight collaborations across the libraries. So I think it's worked really well for us.
I suppose I was interested in that point from the perspective of whether that implies that there is I suppose, a trend or an interest in consortial solutions as opposed to individual institutions. I'm conscious in the sense that where that has happened, for example, adoption of haiku by the Palni-Palsi consortia has been specifically driven because they had a driver to find a solution that would suit a whole host of libraries across an area, rather than each of them find an individual solution. And that's proving to be very beneficial to them, certainly.
So I guess for the one we split off on the top, providing access to unique collections, does that mean providing access to collections in unique ways? Or, you know, is it a notion about customizability, or?
Yeah, I guess it could be, but what I was thinking of was providing access to the library's unique collections. I was thinking broadly about all of the collections that the libraries provide access to, and a gap that we had in Tisch Library was, you know, having a platform where we could digitize unique collections or provide access to unique born digital collections, and you know, Samvera allows us to do that.
Alicia, are you using Hyrax repos for all this?
We are using Hyrax, and Margaret's gonna, if Margaret is still here, she can jump in, and I think we've moved to 2.0 with the last migration.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Alicia. I'm backing you up.
Okay.
And we've recently moved from Fedora 3 to Fedora 4.
Mm-hmm.
That took a long time.
Mm-hmm.
There was one of the points that was made earlier, which was about a reluctance of some institutions, senior management, to engage in open. I suppose I'm curious as to, are there specific reasons why that may be? I know there's a whole host of traditional reasons why some senior people don't like engaging in open, but I wondered whether there was any specific aspects which more structured open source communities like Samvera, but others as well, can help to, or are helping to address.
I think that two things that, you know, I've heard people articulate is one, it's expensive, and and the developer the developer sync that it requires is, I think that proprietary software or off-the-shelf software is seen as cheaper in the long run, mm-hmm. and more stable. Mm. It's a.
Alicia, do you think part of that is the administrative thing, that money comes in different buckets, that if the bucket is staff, it seems very, very expensive, and if the bucket is consultants and
yeah, I do think that
capital funding and things like that, I mean, I think I don't even want to guess how deep that bucket is.
Yeah, Right.
And ours is pretty shallow, but it, I think it's a really good point, just how, what is sustainable about the Samvera direction that may not be sustainable or desirable about the commercial or proprietary direction. Again, you go down the road a ways and you end up paying 2 big vendors for overlapping periods of service that take twice as long as you thought it would. And, so again, depends maybe on the scale of what you're trying to do, but maybe I think it's helpful to understand that there's a great diversity in the kinds of resourcing that can make a Samvera solution work, from 2 or 3 really good people to a whole team to reliance on a vendor who I really liked hearing about the way some of the vendors work and the co-sprints, that kind of thing is helpful in understanding that there's, you can balance you can get balance if your own local resource is not quite as strong as it might need to be. I don't know.
And Karen says, yes, and which department has the bucket?
Yeah. I surely don't. I'm using some old buckets anyway, but yeah. And anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think this is one of the challenges because when it comes to, say, building a new physical library, it's amazing what buckets can be opened up and made available because of the reputation, kudos, that such a building can bring to an organization. I realize that it's inherently difficult for a digital space to provide the same type of kudos and reputation necessarily, but I do think that that's maybe part of the challenge that repository development has.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that digital libraries are just not looked at through the same lens as the physical libraries are by administrations.
I was just going to say that what's interesting is right now we had saved up, quote unquote, for a building. I'll turn on my video so Alicia's not alone. We saved up for some building work, and what we're realizing is that we're not going to use any of those funds right now. Unlike actually the last economic downturn where we were able to do building work, we don't think that's going to happen this time around. And we're starting to think, well, maybe what we need to do is invest as much funds as we need to into the digital infrastructure, because right now that's really where we need it.
All right, as Simeon says, it seems right now they're rather handy. It's true.
Seize the day.
I think that's a really serious point. I was going to say that some of our leadership kind of dreams that our repository would become sort of the what our marketing and communications department wants to be. That is, this really vivid and exciting portal that you can kind of go down many paths and so forth. Of course, we'd like to be that too. But it's an interesting, it's a relationship that is not very strong at this point, the sort of marketing, communications, branding, et cetera, with the repository. I would imagine Stanford might be an outlier in that analysis, but I mean, I think Stanford does very well to sort of brand all the things that their repository does. I'm sure that's true for many of you as well. But anyway, I think we keep trying to make that relationship with marketing, and it's a tough one to make. their point of view is so different.
Yeah, they're worried about marketing the university to people who want to come and then forget the internal marketing that needs to happen. Like even within my own organization, our internal marketing and communications and events team, they're so donor focused. They lose sight of the bigger picture of, you know, yes, donors are important, totally important. But if we didn't have any of the researchers or students and they weren't able to do their work, none of us would exist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, plenty of food for thought there, but we have reached the end of our time formally. So I'd like to offer a formal thanks to everyone who's joined us this afternoon, and also to all those people who have had to step away from the call already. But thank you for your input. It's been some useful discussion. We've captured some useful points, and we'll certainly look to take those forward, as well as share the slides and any further learning from this workshop. So thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks everyone. Nabila, Alicia, Karen.
Bye.
Thanks for coming. Bye.